Chapter 3, Evolution, Biodiversity, and Population Ecology. The case study is about Hawaii's and their native forest birds. What you need to know from this case study is that Hawaiian forests are famous for having a lot of endemic species, and they're in serious threat. I read articles from magazines and newspapers a lot about what's happening to Hawaii and their forests, threats from invasive species and from disease. They're in bad shape, and you can see that from the case study. Down here, know the definition of what a species is, which is an organism. If you can mate, you're the same species. If you cannot mate or you don't mate, you're not the same species. And we redefine species a lot because sometimes we find out that two separate species that we thought didn't mate do mate, and then as scientists we redefine them as the same species. So a population is a group of the same species living in a particular area. So we could say the population of American crows in Santa Clarita, for example. Going on to page 50, you do not need to know anything about macroevolution for this course. In fact, evolution in this course is not even a big part at all. You may be asked on the AP test about natural selection, which is something you learned in biology class. And on occasion, you'll see one or two questions about this, but not very much at all. But if you remember back from biology class, natural selection is survival of the fittest. So if you've got a good trait, you survive. If you don't in that particular environment, you don't survive. Now, an adaptation being good or bad depends on the circumstance. An adaptation in the desert would not be good in the rainforest. And so your trait has to match the situation, the habitat that the species is in. So what drives natural selection? It's mutation. Without genetic mutation, you wouldn't have variation in species, and so you would not have some surviving and some dying, depending on whether or not they had a good or bad trait. There's a couple of terms that the AP test uses. One is called selected for, which means it has a good trait and it survives, and selected against means a bad trait and dies. Sometimes selected against we call maladapted. So you could say that being a cactus in the desert is maladaptive to the rainforest. So if you stuck a cactus and you put it in the rainforest, it would be maladapted because it has the wrong adaptations for survival there. All right, so down here we have different types of selection. So know this figure in caption here. I don't have a little sticky note, but please add one. For figure 3.2, you need to know that we have different types of selection. This would be adapting for a shorter beak or a longer beak. So read the caption to see how that is. All right, page 52, you need to know what artificial selection is. And basically, we have been doing that as humans for a long time. We artificially have created crops and livestock and breeds of dogs for our own purposes. And so we basically breed together traits that we find naturally through mutations, and we like, hey, that's a great trait, let's breed that specifically. And we've been doing that for thousands of years as humans. So artificial selection is something that humans do. On page 53, know the definition of biological diversity, which most people just call biodiversity. And then know what allopatric speciation is, and you can see the picture here. So two species can emerge when they are separated from each other. So let's say you have this fly living here, and then a lava flow breaks this fly into two separate populations. And over time, this color is selected for on this little habitat island, and this color is selected for here. And then at some point, the lava flow, the hardened magma, starts to break down. New plants can grow, and so now these flies can interbreed or intermingle, but if they don't breed together, we now call them separate species. And so this is an example of allopatric or geographical speciation. So types of allopatric or geographical isolation include lava flows, but glaciers coming in can cut off land. A river can change courses. They do that, not so much these days because we alter rivers with like cement walls and things, but before the last 100 years or so, rivers could change course. Mountains could rise through plate tectonics and cut off species, sea level rising, or drought as well. Okay, the next type of speciation occurs when you have one species and all of a sudden one population of that species starts to do things differently than the rest of its species. So that population may start to feed on different plants. It may choose a different time to reproduce, maybe because its climate has changed and now it has to change and reproduce at a different time. Or that population may have undergone mutation. Well, let me talk about this last one here. Mutation with asexual reproduction. So this occurs in plants or in things like bacteria. And what that means is that if you're a plant that can reproduce by sending a runner underground to make a new plant, and you mutate, and you cannot breed with your own kind anymore through sexual reproduction through your flowers, then you can clone yourself through runners and create your own species, and then basically your clones can sexually mate with each other. And so that would be an example of sympatric speciation as well. All right, you don't need to know anything about the big old fossil record, no phylogenetic trees. We don't need to know any of that for our course. You really don't need to know taxonomy for this course either. We've never been asked on the AP tests about taxonomy. But in general, you should know perhaps from biology class that we have domains, but really most people start with kingdoms. We are in the animal kingdom. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species is how we classify things. All right, we don't really need to know anything about evolutionary chains for this class at all. And you do not need to know anything about dinosaurs or geologic times or anything like that. So going on to 59, the definition of endemic means that it's a species that is found only in one place on Earth. Some examples, your book has one called the Yosemite toad. Now we have one in our river, the Santa Clara River. We have a fish that's only found here. It's a subspecies. It's called the unarmored three-spined stickleback fish. It's a subspecies of the three-spined stickleback fish. And some of you are thinking, well, there's no water in our river. Well, there actually is water starting at about Magic Mountain and flowing to the ocean by Oxnard. We have water there year-round because we treat our wastewater and dump it in at that point, and also some creeks feed in, like Piru Creek. So we do have water year-round in our river, just on the outskirts of town by Magic Mountain, and that's where that fish is found. And it's a highly endangered endemic species. So species have been going extinct for a long time. This is called the background rate of extinction. And really only about I mean, 99% of our species have been extinct. So most of the species that we find in the fossil record are already gone. And that's our background rate of extinction. There have been many mass extinctions. The most famous one that we think about is the KT event, which is the dinosaur extinction. We've had 5 previous mass extinctions that we know from the fossil record, where we have huge numbers of species and phyla disappearing. We are currently in the middle of a 6th mass extinction that is man-made, which means through habitat loss primarily, and also poaching and invasive species that have been brought by man, we are wiping out a huge amount of species on the planet. And we'll talk about that in subsequent chapters. All right, page 60, levels of ecological organization. So know the definition of ecology. Know this chart with all of its definitions. So know the definition of biosphere, ecosystem, community, population, and organism. Know the definition of an ecosystem and habitat as well. On page 61, know what a generalist is versus a specialist. A generalist can live in lots of places and eat lots of food. Think of a coyote. A coyote is a generalist. Specialist would be something like a mountain lion, where it has to only eat fresh kills and it has a large range and needs wild habitat, where coyotes can kind of live with humans in our neighborhoods. So a specialist is more likely to become endangered or extinct because if one of its food sources goes away, and it only eats that food source, then it's out of luck, where a generalist could just switch food sources. All right, over here to page 62, one of the most famous extinctions that we've had is the passenger pigeon. So read this picture and caption about the history of the passenger pigeon. And then on page 63, we have ways that populations distribute themselves. We have random, uniform, and clumped. And so make sure you know the description of those 3 kinds of ways that populations distribute themselves. Turn to page 65. So we have here survivorship curves. And so a type 1 survivorship curve is us. And typically you have a high living rate. So if this is humans in type 1, most children stay alive. Now we do have a few children or infants that die, but typically most stay alive and then they start to die off as they get older. A type 2 has equal death rates in old and young, and a type 3 means a high death rate when you're young, but once you reach a certain age, you live for a long time. So type 1 would be humans and apes and whales. Basically, your top predators and large mammals would usually be type 1. Type 2, equal death rates. A lot of birds really have equal death rates when they're young or old. Now, type 3 are usually your prey animals. Plants and seeds, like think of an oak tree, releases a huge amount of acorns, and most of them are eaten, but if one grows into an oak tree, it lives a really long time. Sea turtles, same thing. Once a sea turtle gets to be a certain size, it's going to live for 100 years or more. But the babies tend to be eaten by other species. And we'll continue on with the next video.